Just after midnight on the 14th of July, 2026, a Russian tanker captain anchored off the Kerch Strait keyed his radio to complain that the water around him was too crowded. 40 hulls, packed in tight, waiting their turn to run fuel into occupied Crimea. He thought the crowd was safety. It was the opposite. 200 kilometers inland, a Ukrainian operator was already watching him on a satellite feed, steering a propeller-driven drone the size of a small plane toward his deck. Within the hour, 11 of those ships were burning. Why they were there at all is the trap. To understand what happened over those few hours in the Sea of Azov, you have to understand a mistake. Not a Ukrainian one. A Russian one made weeks earlier and hundreds of kilometers away, in the offices where Moscow decides how to keep occupied Crimea fed with fuel. That decision put those tankers exactly where Ukrainian strike unit wanted them. And it started, as most of these stories now do, with a man named Robert Brovdy. Brovdy goes by the call sign Magyar. He commands Ukraine's unmanned systems forces. The branch stood up specifically to industrialize drone warfare across every domain the country fights in. Under him sits a growing constellation of strike units, and in the summer of 2026 that command created something new. A dedicated deep strike center, a single node whose only job is to plan and coordinate long-range unmanned attacks on targets far behind the line of contact. Not the front. Not the trenches, the rear, the depots, the airfields, the bridges, and the ships. This was the center's night, and this was not a one-off. It was the sharpest increment in a campaign that had already been grinding through Russia's Azov and Black Sea logistics for weeks. Ukrainian claims through the middle of July put the 4-day blitz around this strike at roughly 35 tankers and cargo ships hit in 96 hours. 11 of them fell in a single night. Treat the campaign totals as what they are. Ukrainian figures, climbing week after week, corroborated in pieces rather than all at once. But the core of the night is not in dispute because part of it burned in view of the Russian coast, and even a Russian governor admitted it. Start with the geography because the geography is the whole point. The Sea of Azov is a shallow, almost landlocked pond in the northeast corner of the Black Sea, connected to the larger sea by one narrow gate, the Kerch Strait, spanned by the bridge Russia built after seizing Crimea in 2014. For most of this war, the Azov was Russia's safest water, a Russian lake. Its shores were held on every side by Russian or occupied territory, its approaches screened by air defense, its traffic protected by distance. Ships moved across it the way trucks move down a highway in peacetime. Nobody expected to be hit out there. That assumption is what died first. What crosses that water matters more than it looks. Occupied Crimea is a peninsula. It has almost no domestic fuel production of its own. Everything that runs an engine there, military or civilian, has to be brought in, and it comes in by 3 routes. Over the Kerch Bridge by road and rail, up the single land corridor through the north, and across the Azov by ship. Small courier tankers shuttle diesel and petrol from the Russian mainland ports into Crimean harbors, keeping the peninsula's garrisons fueled, its vehicles moving, and its role as a launch pad for strikes into southern Ukraine alive. Cut that flow, and Crimea starts to starve in the most literal military sense. It runs out of the thing that makes armies move. Many of these ships had a second life too. They were part of what analysts call the shadow fleet, aging, often sanctioned tankers sailing under flags of convenience that Russia uses to move crude oil onto world markets while dodging the price caps meant to choke its war revenue. The same hull that runs diesel into Kerch this week might load Russian export crude next week. That makes each one a double target. Sink it and you deny Crimea its fuel. Sink it, and you also take a brick out of the wall that funds the invasion. The oil money is the war's bloodstream. These little ships were capillaries feeding it, now the trap. For months, Ukraine had been closing the other routes. The Kerch Bridge has been struck repeatedly and its rail traffic disrupted. The land corridor is under constant pressure. Air defense along the Crimean and Azov coasts has been systematically hunted and thinned. The Black Sea Fleet, the force that was supposed to own these waters, has spent this war being driven from its own harbors, with warship after warship sent to the seabed, and the survivors pushed east to hide. So when Ukraine tightened its wider blockade of Crimea and fuel began to run short, Moscow faced a choice. Let the peninsula run dry or rush the tankers in to break the blockade by weight of numbers. Moscow chose the tankers. It pushed them into the Azov and funneled them toward the Kerch Strait, where they bunched up waiting to transit or offload. Roughly 40 hulls, by Ukrainian count, crowded into a stretch of water near the one gate they all had to pass through. To a fuel planner in Rostov, that looked like throughput. To the Deep Strike Center, it looked like a firing range with the targets pre-sorted and lined up. Everything now depended on whether Ukraine had a weapon that could reach them. That is where the FP-2 comes in, and it is worth being precise about what it is, because almost every headline gets it wrong. The FP-2 is not a sea drone. It does not skim across the surface of the water like the naval kamikaze boats that made headlines earlier in the war. It is not an FPV quadcopter either. The small battery-powered racing drones that hunt tanks a few kilometers from the trench. The FP-2 is an aircraft, a fixed-wing, propeller-driven, long-range strike drone built by the Ukrainian company Firepoint, with a reach of roughly 200 kilometers and a warhead in the region of 105 kilograms. That is not a grenade taped to a hobby drone. That is a flying bomb heavier than most artillery shells, delivered onto a target with precision, from a launch point deep inside safe Ukrainian-controlled ground. Here is why that combination changes everything. A short-range FPV could never touch these ships. The anchorage near Kerch sits far beyond the front, out of reach of anything with a battery and a 20-kilometer radius. To strike ships in the Azov you need range, you need a warhead big enough to gut a tanker, and you need a way to hit something that is floating and can move. The FP-2 answers all three. It launches from mobile ground installations, ramps and rails that can be set up, fired, and packed away before Russian reconnaissance ever finds them. It cruises for the better part of 200 kilometers on a small engine, quiet and low. And in the final seconds, an operator takes over. That last part is the piece that turns a long-range bomb into a ship hunter. Most deep strike drones fly to fixed coordinates. A building does not move. A parked aircraft does not move. But a tanker at anchor can shift, and a tanker underway certainly does. So in the terminal phase, a Ukrainian operator, watching through the drone's own feed over a satellite link, steers the FP-2 manually onto the specific hull. The specific point on the deck. The specific waterline where the damage will be worst. A man sitting in a shelter 200 kilometers away, flying the last 1,000 meters of a bomb's life by hand, picking which part of the ship dies. That is the capability Russia had no plan for. Building the target list took longer than the strike. In the days before the 14th, reconnaissance had to find the ships, count them, and fix their positions. This is the unglamorous half of every deep strike operation and the half that decides it. Long-endurance reconnaissance drones, satellite passes, and the steady accumulation of open-source ship tracking all fed into one picture, where the tankers were gathering, how many, how tightly packed, and when the anchorage was fullest. The Deep Strike Center wanted the moment of maximum crowding. A half-empty anchorage is a handful of hits. A full one is a massacre of steel, so they waited for the ships to do the one thing the fuel crisis guaranteed they would do: pile up. By the second week of July, the picture was ripe. Somewhere in the planning cells, the count near Kerch had climbed toward 40 hulls, and the reconnaissance feeds were clean enough to assign individual drones to individual ships. The launch teams moved to their mobile sites, far inland, well back from any Russian eyes. Fuel loaded, warheads armed, satellite links checked. Somewhere on the Russian side, a logistics officer looked at the same crowded anchorage on his own screens and felt, if anything, relief. The fuel was flowing again. Crimea would be topped up. The blockade was being beaten. He had no idea he was looking at the setup, not the solution. The first FP-2 left its rail in the dark, climbing away from a field hundreds of kilometers from the sea it was aimed at. That was the easy part of the night. The hard part was still 200 kilometers of open flight away, and the ships could still scatter if Russia realized what was coming. But that wasn't the most dangerous variable in this mission. That part came at the coast, where the drones had to cross into the one stretch of sky Russia was supposed to still own. Follow that first drone across the water. It flies low and slow by fighter standards, a small propeller aircraft in a black sky, its engine a faint drone lost under the wind. Below and ahead, the Azov opens up, and beyond it the cluster of lights and radar returns that is the Kerch anchorage. On paper, this airspace is defended. Russia has spent years layering air defense over Crimea and the Strait, the Panzer systems, the longer-range batteries, the guns meant to swat exactly this kind of threat out of the sky. But that layer has been bleeding out for months under a deliberate Ukrainian campaign to hunt it down, and every battery destroyed is a hole the next wave flies through. The FP-2s went for the holes. At the same time, on the ships, almost nothing happened because almost nobody understood what was arriving. Picture the crews. Small courier tankers, thin civilian and paramilitary manning, anchored in a familiar crowd of other ships in what has always been safe water. No expectation of air attack out here. Radios busy with the mundane traffic of an anchorage waiting its turn, fuel manifests, offload slots, complaints about the crowding. Somewhere in that chatter, the captain who thought the crowd was protection. He was about to learn that 40 ships packed together do not defend each other. They just make it impossible to miss. The first impact went in against a tanker's hull, and the physics of the FP-2 did the rest. 100 kilograms and more of warhead against thin merchant steel, into a hull that by its nature is full of fuel. There is no clean version of this. The blast opens the ship, the fuel finds the fire, and a courier tanker becomes a column of flame standing on the water, throwing orange light across the whole anchorage and lighting up every hull around it for the next drone in the queue. That is the cruelty of the crowding, seen from the Ukrainian side. The first fire was a spotlight. It turned the darkness that hid the fleet into a stage that displayed it. From there, the night became methodical. This is what a deep strike center is for. And it showed. Drone after drone came in off the same cruise track, each one taken over by an operator in the final seconds, each one put onto a fresh hull. One ship burning, then two, then more, the operators working down the target list the reconnaissance had built. On the Russian nets, the comm broke fast. Intercepted chatter on Russian logistics and coastal channels turned from routine to chaos inside minutes. According to Ukrainian accounts of the night, reports of hits, reports of fire, demands to know what was attacking, orders that could not be followed because there was nothing to shoot back at that anyone could see. The drones came from the dark and the operators steered from another region entirely. Try to answer that attack from the Russian side, and you find you have nothing to answer it with. The threat is a small, low, slow aircraft, hard to see and easy to lose in surface clutter, arriving over water where you assumed no one would ever strike. The air defense that should stop it has been hunted down over months. The Black Sea fleet that should own this sea is on the seabed or hiding in the east. Aviation that might sweep the corridor has been pushed back out of range. So the tankers did the only thing panicked ships in a crowded anchorage can do. They tried to scatter, into water full of other ships also trying to scatter, while the operators picked out the ones still worth hitting. A moving target is exactly the target the FP-2 was designed to run down. By the time the night's tally was counted, 11 ships were down or burning from this increment alone, according to the unmanned systems forces. 11 vessels in a single night in water Russia had treated as untouchable. From a weapon launched 200 kilometers away and flown onto its targets by hand in the last seconds. And that number is not the campaign. That is one night inside the 96-hour blitz that Ukrainian claims put at around 35 tankers and cargo ships hit. 11 was the increment. The campaign was the story. But the single most damning proof of the night did not come from Kiev at all. It came from Russia. Some of the ships did not burn near Kerch. They burned near Taganrog off the Russian coast itself, deep in the northeast corner of the Azov, in water that is about as far into the Russian rear as this sea gets. And the governor of Russia's Rostov region admitted it, acknowledging that 2 tankers had been hit near Taganrog. That admission matters more than any Ukrainian claim because it is the enemy confirming the reach. It means the FP-2s were not just striking the contested gate at Kerch. They were reaching all the way across the Azov to the Russian mainland shore and setting tankers on fire in sight of a Russian city. There is no safe corner of that sea left. The governor's own words drew the new map. Walk through what was actually destroyed because the loss is not only the steel. Each of these ships is a link in the chain that keeps occupied Crimea fueled, and each one lost is fuel that never arrives. The tankers were rushed into the Azov precisely to break the blockade, to pour diesel and petrol into a peninsula running short. Instead of delivering that fuel, they burned it into the sky over the anchorage. The cargo they were carrying to relieve the shortage became the accelerant that destroyed them. A ship sent to end a fuel crisis that instead adds its own cargo to the flames is the most efficient possible outcome for the side that lit it. Then there is the shadow fleet dimension, the second target inside every target. These hulls were part of the fleet Russia uses to move sanctioned crude and dodge the price caps. Everyone on the bottom of the Azov is a hull that will never carry Russian export oil again. The strike doubles as a blow to the revenue that funds the war. This is the logic the Deep Strike Center is built around. Find the single object that is simultaneously a military supply link and a piece of the war economy, and remove it once to hurt both. A courier tanker near Kerch was exactly that object. Fuel for the garrison in one hold, a place in the oil export chain in the other, and a Ukrainian operator 200 kilometers away choosing where the warhead goes. Add up the strategic picture, and the phrase that keeps surfacing in Ukrainian assessments is a maritime rear that no longer exists. Consider what Russia has lost around this sea. Its Azov and Black Sea air defense is being destroyed and thinned faster than it can be replaced. The Black Sea fleet has been driven off and sunk hull by hull across this war. Aviation has been pushed back out of the fight over these waters. The Kerch Bridge and its rail line are under repeated strike. Sea supply to Crimea, the shipping route that this night was meant to protect, is being shut down one tanker at a time. Strip all that away and Russia is left holding Crimea by a thread, the single land neck in the north, the corridor through Armyansk. One road watched into a peninsula that used to be a fortress. For the people running the occupied peninsula, the consequences are already arriving. With the sea route burning and the other route squeezed, fuel in Crimea has been turning, in the words used by Ukrainian officials, into something like gold. Gasoline becomes scarce, then rationed, then a currency of its own. A peninsula that was supposed to be Russia's unsinkable staging base for the war in the south becomes a place that has to count its leaders. Every military vehicle there runs on fuel that now has to survive a gauntlet to arrive. The FP-2s did not just sink 11 ships. They put a meter on every engine in Crimea and set it ticking down. Step back to the weapon one more time, because this is where the doctrine lies. Remember the point made at the start. The FP-2 could do what no short-range drone ever could. That is the shift this night proved out at scale. For years, deep strike meant cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, weapons that cost millions and exist in limited numbers. What Ukraine has built with the FP-2 is a long-range precision, ship-killing capability out of a propeller-driven drone launched off a mobile rail, flown onto a moving target by an operator on a satellite link. It brings the reach of a missile to the price and the numbers of a drone. That is why 11 ships could burn in one night, and why the campaign total keeps climbing. When the weapon is cheap enough to send in waves and smart enough to be flown by hand at the end, a crowded anchorage stops being a fleet and becomes a queue. There is one Russian assumption at the center of all of this, and it is the loop worth closing. The tanker captain who complained that the water was too crowded believed the crowd was safety. He was reading an old map, the one where the Azov was a Russian lake and the only danger was a collision in the dark. Moscow read the same old map when it funneled 40 hulls toward Kerch to break a blockade. The Deep Strike Center read a different map, the new one, where the Azov is a shooting gallery and a crowd of tankers is a target list that sorts itself. Between those two maps lies the whole story of the night, and the difference between them was drawn by a weapon Russia still has no answer for. The Sea of Azov was Russia's safe water for 11 years. It was the quiet corner, the internal lake, the route nobody had to defend. On the night of the 14th of July, 2026, 11 ships turned that idea to smoke in view of the Russian coast, flown by operators who never left dry land. The men who pushed those tankers into the crowd near Kerch thought they were beating a blockade. They were assembling one. The rear that Russia counted on for 11 years is gone, and the fuel that was supposed to keep Crimea alive is at the bottom of the sea that was supposed to be safe.